always a pleasant experience for a teacher to see that their students are performing better than them. I am in such a mood today. We have two speakers of the day, Dr. Nikhil Damodaran and Dr. G.V. Nathaniel. I had the fortune of teaching them. And of course, DN also. And for what I'm saying about is also true of DN. And during their student days, they were different. They were different from the crowd. And that difference was sustained. In Malayalam, there's a saying that Mulayil Ariyam Mulakkaruthu. എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞതുപോലെ, they have sustained that difference, and both of them are doing exceedingly well and making their mark in their respective area of competence. Coming to the speaker of the day, Nikhil. Nikhil did his MPhil over there in CDS, and then he went for his PhD in Louisiana. And currently he is with the OP Jindal University and holding a visiting position with Monash University, Australia. And I will come to the topic which anyway they are going to talk. And Nathaniel was also having the what is called I had the privilege of being his kind of supervisor for some time. And the difference with the Nathaniel, I thought that his ability to understand, because I know him a little bit more better than Nikhil, because about Nikhil I used to hear a lot about from Misra. And Misra being my neighbor and my very close colleague, I knew him that way very much. So Nathaniel's ability to work on a broad range of issues, that is really remarkable. And after joining his first job in RBI, he was working with Deputy Governor, late Dr. Subir Gokhran, one of my best friends. And Subir was talking so high of him, which I felt very happy. And later, the next RBI governor also spotted his competence. And at that time, still he's working on inflation-related issues. And the next, what is the next, was the RBI governor, Dr. Ram Rajan. And under his scheme of capacity building, they selected a few with very high fellowship, I must say. And he selected in British Columbia. Therein, he has done substantial work. And one of his papers came out in Harvard Business School working papers. And he has a number of good publications. And both of them are that way, doing exceedingly well. And at this juncture, I would like to remind you of one of the points that came out of the last term paper discussions when you are talking about inflation transmission and monetary policy. What we are talking about was, in a country like ours, when you're talking about macroeconomics, inflation at a macro level, you will be concealing more than what is being revealed. What is needed in a country like ours, for example, we have a population of what, 140, and we have a country of what, 28 states. Compare with EU, a population of what, and we have a GDP of $4 trillion. And compare that with EU, 27 countries, and you have a population of 1/3 of us, something like 30, 40 billion, 40 crores. And of course, their GDP may be 3 times, almost 3.5 times ours. So in such a context like ours, we need, what is actually needing is a much more microeconomically informed macroeconomics. And in a region, in an economy like ours, the interregional spillovers, interregional trade, and the fiscal policies that is undertaken, not necessarily RBI's, of course, but Nathaniel's team and all, they are all doing is very good. And, he is also the RBI bulletin editor, and he is the lead author of the State of the Economy article in the RBI bulletin. And with due importance to all that, what is actually of importance is what Nikhil is going to talk today. In a country like ours, which is as big as a continent, and given the diversity, that spillovers and the implications of the transmission mechanism that takes place interregionally. I often used to think that a developed region within an underdeveloped setup may not be able to get its full potential very because of the fact that you are among the less developed states. This is like in a university. Suppose you are with excellent students, your colleagues are remarkable, you get benefited. Suppose you are only one and all others are not doing well, you will be also be pulled down. And I think what today he is going to talk about is something very pertinent to Indian context. So we have a very dynamic two scholars, and we are extremely happy that both of them have accepted our invitation. And first of all, on behalf of all those who are logged in online and offline, and the GIFT community at large, with a lot of appreciation, and we welcome you for this meeting. So, without much ado, I think it's already late, 3:40, and I know Nikhil is aware of the rules of the game. It's the same. So first, you will take something like 30 to 40 minutes. Oh, there's a chair. You're right. I am only welcome. You're right. There is the chair. That's right. Oh, Nadani is the chair. I was thinking Nadani is going to be the discussant. Okay, fine. Nadani is going to to decide the chair. So I will. So you will be having the role of daughterly chair. You will be also discussant. Okay. It's not just chair. So chair is actually, you should have been given a much more of a hardworking job. Kindly don't think that your job is only chairing. That you are informed of that. Okay. So I welcome both of you. And now over to you, Dr. Nathaniel. Please chair the session and conduct the proceedings, and also do the job of discussant.
Thank you, Professor Joseph, for those kind words. And it is really a privilege to be part of this endeavor of Gulati Institute. And I'm so happy to see Nikhil, and excited to hear about what he has to say. And it's always nice to come back to your roots. And I know that some of the people who you've been mentored with are there is kind of both an exciting thing as well as kind of a litmus test for you when you do things. So I hope that we stand up to the standards that have been set by these stalwarts in Indian academics. And with this, I was very happy when I was asked to chair this talk, because subnational economic development and the macro implications of that is something which is also part of my research agenda. I'm working on a few works on, what are the implications of national level price divergences for common regions with monetary policy and stuff like that. So therefore, when I was asked to be part of this endeavor, I was really happy. And as in introductory remarks, Professor Joseph said that in a country like India, where we have a lot of heterogeneity, oftentimes we forget the fact that we set one monetary policy, we use one national fiscal policy, where are the effects of that could be very divergent across states, and the state level policies could have spillover effects onto other states. And to that extent, today's work on fiscal transfers in India and its impact at the national local level is very pertinent. And so that being said, from the point of view of relevance of India, this also is an important area of research which is coming up globally, because in terms of identifying causal relationships in macro variables, there is always a limit in terms of using time series models because of the identification issues. And people have been increasingly using spatial variation to identify the causal effects or to estimate multipliers, which exactly what Nikhil's paper today does. So if students of economics who are thinking about working on frontier issues, this is not only important from a public policy point of view, but this is also what the cutting edge research is about, that use spatial variation to identify causal relationship in macro variables. And to that extent, I am also very excited to see that a novel approach, or the approach which is gaining quite prominence in international macro in recent years, is what we are going to hear. And I'm sure that our PhD students are going to benefit by listening to what cutting edge research is all about. So that's my introductory remarks, and I don't want to take away the limelight from the presenter. I'm sure we are all going to be benefited from his remarks. And Nikhil, you would have the time. I think 45 minutes is what was said. So you would have that much time, and then post that we will open up for discussion, and then for the questions from the floor, if any. So that's what we are. Over to you, Nikhil.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for Joseph sir and Daniel for that introduction to the literature, and Joseph sir for just giving me the opportunity to present this paper, which is, I think, the agenda of Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation. I think, if it is not, it should be on the agenda of the institute. But without doing too much, you can see that the time here is 8:15, 8:20. So I'm at the end of my day. So I'm tired, but I'm really excited to present this. So without a lot of discussion on that, I'll head straight to the issue. Now, today's presentation, the idea of today's presentation is a few things. I want to talk about regional fiscal policies, and I don't want to just give you empirical evidence. I want to give you a framework with which we want to think about fiscal policies in India. And this is not taking care of federal fiscal policies. This is just talking about regional fiscal policies. One caveat which I should include before talking about the regional fiscal policies is this idea that, hey, fiscal policies or the legal framework of fiscal policy across states have not remained constant. They've changed over time. So I'm aware of that. But even having said that, the economic essence of those policies still remains the same. Whether you call it a VAT or a sales tax or now a GST, it's essentially taxes on goods and so on. So I'll take the economic framework to be a broad economic framework. And the period that I'm covering in terms of thinking about the policy is 1980 to 2022. So with all those changes and all those shocks, I'm just giving you a framework. The talk has three parts to it. And the talk is part pedagogic and part research based. So I want to also present to you this mix of spatial evidence, as Nathaniel pointed out, and a macro framework for subnational economies. Both of these issues have had amazing prominence. In fact, you might be surprised that there are a lot of econometrica and JPE papers coming up on precisely this topic, and I think we are running behind. And excellent work. So I'll sort of follow the framework. Without a lot of introduction, let me get right to it. So there are 2 points which I want to put in before developing a framework. The first is a quote by Fiscal in which he says, and he's talking about open economies, right? But I'm thinking of those quotes by Fiscal and Mandel in a closed economy or a currency union setup, in the sense that states are these open economies and you apply the Fiscal and the Mandelian quote to states in India. What the first quote says is that the price level in one state will be very much affected by the price level in its neighboring state with which it trades. So for instance, Kerala's price level will be affected by Tamil Nadu, and Tamil Nadu's vice versa. So that's a fact. I don't think that needs a lot of discussion, but how much is the question here? The second thing which Mandel talks about, and which is very distinct in the subnational economies, is this need to not think of them as open economies in the traditional sense of the word, but think of them in terms of gold standard economies, in the sense that they are fixed exchange rates, and they, despite having fixed exchange rate, have imperfect coordination in the fiscal sense of the term, which implies then that their response to shocks are very asymmetric. So Kerala doesn't call up Tamil Nadu and say, hey, what's happening? What are you doing if there's a monetary policy change? What are you going to do? How are you going to react to it fiscally, right? These are independent fiscal agents and they have their own best interest at hand. Now, a larger question then is that in this setup, why are the fiscal responses asymmetric? Because we observe this asymmetry. Just to give you some context to the asymmetry, these are growth rates and government purchases, total spending of the government for all the years in the sample. The left panel is Andhra and Kerala. So I've taken only southern states. And in all the discussion that I am going to do, you should think of these states as either all south, all east, all north, all west, because there is hardly any flow. There is actually limited flow, which is of significance from south to north, east to west, and so on. So think of it as within south states, within north states, and so on, and all the extensions would follow, right? So this left-hand panel, you can see the fitted line for Andhra, and you can see the fitted line for Kerala. They reverse in their use of government spending, which means in times of, and how do I read it? In times of high growth, or government spending in Andhra leads to high growth, whereas government spending in Kerala does not lead to high growth. I don't think there should be causal attribution to this. To be safe, I think there is a positive association between growth and government spending, and in Kerala, it's a negative association. So there is a flipping of the sign. Now, this flipping of the sign is even true for other fiscal instruments which states have. To fix your idea of the kind of fiscal instruments that I'm going to talk about in this talk, they are of three kinds. Specifically, I'm not focusing on the fourth kind. One is government spending. The other is VAT, value added tax or sales tax, or you can think of it as GST. The third is an excise duty. And there is another instrument which is really important, which is taxes on vehicles. So I'm not going to talk about taxes on vehicles, but except that, I'll talk about the other three instruments which form bulk of their budgetary services. Now you can see the flipping or the reversal of correlations between VAT and GSDP, also between Andhra and Karnataka. So you can imagine that I would have chosen these states where signs flip, but that's precisely the point. Why do these states flip the signs? Like, why are they behaving so differently, or why are their fiscal policies having different effects? If you want to generalize these evidences, this is excise duty. So excise duty also flips between Karnataka and Goa. And if you look at the wagon wheel of excise GDP relationship, it fills the whole wheel. Like, there is no semblance of a sense of why these relationships are like that, which means certainly these states are working on different parameters. They're working on different parameters. They are optimizing different economies, and they're using instruments differently. That's the point that I want to drive here, right? Now, again, these are unstructured evidences. They are only correlations, not causations of any sense. Now, to put a bit of structure to this data, the whole point is, why do these states use different policies, and why is there so much variation in their use of government spending and taxation and so on and so forth? For me, an easy way to think about this is, in Himachal Pradesh, a lot of factories got set up. And I remember when I was young that my father was worried that a lot of the factories would be set up in Himachal Pradesh. And that is the role of excise and taxation, whereas Delhi or other states did not have this kind of an industrial activity at that point of time. Clearly, Himachal was in a different realm than other states like Punjab and Haryana and so on, right? So why this diversity? The answer to that potentially is because there are different transmission channels of fiscal policies, of these policies, and different states rely on different channels of transmission. So Himachal relied on making Himachal a tax haven, including industrial policy and letting the economy go from within. It did not want, at the cost of a reduction in tax revenue, it sort of said, hey, let's just reduce our taxes, but let the GDP go off itself. Now, to put a bit of structure to this diversity, what I do is I adopt a standard New Keynesian model into the macro fiscal space of Indian states. It needs a bit of caution. I can tell you about the fiscal space, and I'll talk about the macro space in a bit. The fiscal space are VAT, excise, and government spending. So I'm going to talk about these three instruments. In addition to the standard augmentation to the New Keynesian model for fiscal states, which I'll come to, the novel transmission channel which I can think about is trade. Here, I am talking about transmission in an open economy of these policies in the presence of trade. Now, again, we don't have estimates of trade, which is why I have to use a New Keynesian model and think of all the possibilities that might be there. I'm sure post GST, we will have better data, so there can be an empirical work for this, which sort of corresponds to this trade. But and I want to use this model, and I want to come to this idea of an optimal fiscal policy conditional on a few things. One is endowment of factors. Now, optimal fiscal policies are largely, and that is going to be my argument throughout the presentation, largely going to be a factor of endowments, what each state has in terms of its production structure, in terms of its productive capacities, and so on. That's thinking of endowments from a Hexcher-Ollin framework, as well as the other thing which states are good at are the productivity differences. So I'm going to think of these optimal policies from productivity differences. I'm not going to do an optimal policy exercise, but potentially if I do another presentation, that optimal fiscal policy exercise should come into picture, but the presentation otherwise would be very long. So, so that's the framework in which I'll do these things. So once you know that there are these heterogeneities, and in the model sense of the term, you would want to ask, what are the consequences of these heterogeneities? Like, what happens as a result of these different choices by these different states? I call it the impossible convergence. And this is something which can theoretically be developed in terms of the model. The mathematical details can be a tad bit difficult, but the logic is sufficient enough for us to understand. And there is this other aspect of observed or actual empirical divergence. So we are thinking of divergence as a consequence of fiscal policy in this whole framework. So we are thinking, hey, can fiscal policies which are independently chosen by these states be a significant cause for divergence of these states, right? So I'll present empirical evidence first, and then I'll talk about the theoretical framework. Just to get the literature out of the way, the model is a standard open economy model, but standard open economy in the sense that I am using those class of models where transmission across countries matters. So these are standard Ostfeld Rogoff. This is the benchmark JPE paper where they talk about exchange rate determination, but I am using that open economy, large open economy model to understand fiscal spillovers within states in India. And as Professor Joseph was telling us that, hey, in India, it's such a big country that fiscal spillovers can be very, very sizable. And in fact, I remember reading the economic survey of 2017, if I'm not mistaken, where they made a big deal of the size of trade transmissions which were there in India. So I'm actually relying on their accuracy and trying to draw a fiscal framework around their accuracy. There are other optimal fiscal policy models which combine in this framework, talk about what the taxation should be, why are these. So this literature talks about why they're doing what they're doing. This literature is presenting the framework. So I'm going to talk about the model framework in a bit, but this is the reason for using the model framework. So those are the combinations. There are a couple of other literatures to which my work adds to. One literature is the tax and spending multiplier literature. And I think in terms of importance, I don't want to give a lot of importance to the numbers because they're calibrated numbers at best. So I would not vouch yet for my multiplier numbers, but the relative magnitudes will still be fine. But the other important literature, which I'm really excited about, and to which this talk contributes the most, is this idea of adopting these things to subnational economies. And all the papers that I've cited here are either econometric or JPE. So you can see the work is all latest. And these are all people who are interested in this question of subnational economies, partly because aggregate macroeconomics has, in some sense, reached an identification snag, as Nathaniel was pointing out. So we need to look at subnational data to figure out a lot of things. And this is one attempt to look at subnational data, especially fiscal data from my perspective. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's go to the empirical question first. To what extent have these fiscal policies created a wedge among states? So to begin with, and this is just evidence to explain, there is this identification snag that we are talking about. I do absolute and conditional convergence a la Barrow, the standard Barrow procedure, in which what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to understand how much initial condition of these states, and as I mentioned, initial condition for me is endowment, for me is productivity differences. So it's Ricardian versus Hexcher-Olin, that kind of a thing. I can segregate it, but that's the regression that I'm thinking about. It's a simple regression. There's no frills to this one. If my income is higher and if I'm growing further, which means states which have higher income to begin with will have a higher growth rate, and then they will diverge, right? So states which have been doing well will do well. States which have not been doing well will continue to worsen. There is an econometric problem here. If you look at states and within a cross section, Indian states are only 24. You cannot statistically talk about these convergences or divergences. So if you look at columns 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they are all looking at cross-sectional convergences. But on the other hand, if you look at the pooled convergence, average convergence across these time periods from 1980 to 2022, you see there's limited evidence, though the number is significant, but I won't attribute significance to the number because that's just a statistical artifact of having variability in the data, both cross-sectional and time series. So this does not show or give us any conclusive proof of whether there is convergence or divergence. Ideally, we would think there is some divergence based on the common discussion. But I know of a recent paper which talks about convergence, but again, the evidence is scanty. This is what my summary of the absolute convergence discussion is. I think I've talked about these things before, so I'm not going to talk about this anymore. Now let's talk a bit more about conditional convergence. Now, conditional convergence is this idea, and it's again a very simple idea. I'm not doing anything new here. So I'm just running through potentially because these are 101 growth economics, but I'll still give you the intuition. The idea of conditional convergence, and I think my equation just went off somewhere. Okay, so idea of this conditional convergence is that in addition to the initial conditions, you add a bunch of controls because you think these equations are not identified well. Potentially because infrastructure plays a good role, potentially because education and health play a good role. In a macro sense, conditional convergence thinks about a solo model and thinks about convergence from the sense of endowments to the sense of policies. And then it looks at the GSDP of the economy, the initial condition of the economy, and sees whether it makes sense or not. So if I look at the first column here, and what I'm doing here are simple regressions, just to give you a sense. What I'm doing is I'm saying that, okay, let's just explain growth rate of the state in time t and t plus 1. That is explained by its GDP in time t, its government spending in time t, right? So the growth between t and t plus 1 is explained by last year's GDP and last year's government spending. That's what I'm looking at. Obviously, falsely identified regressions, but and there is effect to that. None of these, no matter what fiscal variable I use here, all the fiscal variables come to be insignificant in the presence of this cross, the initial condition of GSDP. If and that's likely from a macro perspective, y equals c plus I plus g, right? You all know the standard macro identity. So if I'm putting y in a regression along with a g, it doesn't make sense because there's an endogeneity issue. So the best thing for me to think about is, okay, let's just remove the y and put the g there. If I put the g there and then ask how much does g explain in convergence, g explains of this, g explains about 0.34. So it's explaining about 1/3 of the convergence, which is explained by initial conditions. Now, the point of doing this regression in here and comparing it to this regression in here is to get sense of the magnitudes. What I'm trying to understand here is that of the contribution by a factor, 1/3 of that contribution is by fiscal policy. And that is true for any fiscal policy you pick up. Like the narrower the fiscal policy is, the lesser the contribution, but the more aggregated the fiscal policy is, the contribution remains about 1/3. Aggregate expenditure, aggregate revenue. And if anybody has any clarificatory comments in between, I would be really happy to accept them here now, because online, I think it's better to chat. If you have any comments are welcome. Right, so that's essentially the idea here. All fiscal policies at the aggregate level, whether it's expenditure or revenue, attributes about 1/3 of the convergence or divergence, which in this case, it's talking about divergence, which is there. This number tells me that higher the government spending by a state, the more its growth rate is going to be in the next period. That's what this does. Now, this regression is, again, a very simplistic regression. Now, you add a bunch of these controls and make it a bit more serious and say, hey, this isn't identified. Let's just try and identify it better by looking at a couple of things. One, capital and labor effectiveness. How do I think about capital and labor effectiveness? I think of capital and labor effectiveness as, so labor effectiveness is education, number of primary schools, health, whether there's health system provided by the government, number of government hospitals, and so on. Infant mortality is a crude control. Effective capital units, credit disbursed, number of public sector banks, gross fixed capital formation, and so on. These are all collected from ASI. All the data is in RBI. It's just a matter of putting it together and building this big data set. The third type of control that I'm thinking about is the environment control. So environment is me thinking about a Hexarolan kind of endowment kind of a sense, right? If there is power, or how much power is there, length of roads and so on. Length of roads is sketchy data, and structure of the economy. There are preconditions, but I am not using gross fiscal deficit because there are issues to including fiscal deficit, well, at least in the model sense. So I'm not using them in regressions too. The summary of these results is that endowment matters. And this can be, I don't think I can call these regressions identifiable. This is what the regressions are. By endowments mattering, I want you to look at this line. I don't want you to pay attention to, well, actually, you can pay attention to the coefficients also, but I want you to look at the significance of ag to GDP ratio. And this has been mentioned in the literature that states which have agriculture or are largely reliant on agriculture are likely to be the states which are likely to have a lower growth rate, because agriculture has its own physical or growth limitations. It is reliant on technology. There are a lot of other bunch of factors such as irrigation availability, weather, and so on, which make agriculture a catch-all term for all these things, right? So that tells me that endowment of a state is particularly important here. And that plays back to the Hexarolan framework that we were thinking about from a state's perspective, right? Now, if I want to think, or if I want to do identification a bit more seriously, and I figure out that, hey, the endowment is actually potentially taking a lot of my fiscal policy effect out, it's turning the regression into an unidentified issue, especially if you compare this result. None of the fiscal policy variables are relevant here. You can't interpret them because the standard error on these is high. That is the presence of this endowment term. So in the absence of this endowment term, now you can see fiscal policy having the effect that you expect to have. So the 1/3%. Now, with greater controls, the percentage or the percentage contribution of government spending increases in these economies. How do I interpret this number? A percentage increase in government spending increases growth rate by, actually, this is 0.72 percentage points. So we should think of the 0.72 percentage points. That's essentially what you should think about. Which means fiscal policies matter when you control for these things seriously, and they can cause divergence. More so, the divergence magnitude is significant. So that's essentially what I'm thinking about. Now, when I think about this regression again, I think of a problem with including taxation, because these are all reduced form estimates, and I don't know whether the spending or the taxation works through its budget or works through other incentives directly to the economy. So the way that I'm thinking about this is whether spending or taxation as an instrument, choice of the instrument matters or not. That's the question that I'm trying to raise. If it does not matter directly, then all the effect is working through the government spending, government budget constraint. If it matters individually in some sense, then these regressions are badly identified. If I run the same regressions and try to look at tax effects, and I do this for sales tax, I can do it for excise duty also, you can see that sales tax is also a stable identified thing in this regression. Sales tax effects are smaller than that of spending. the caveats which are generated for government spending are remain true for sales tax. For me, the takeaway is sales tax is lesser of an instrument to generate growth than government spending, and this is shouted out largely in the literature. But what I want to mention here is how some governments use sales tax versus some governments use fiscal policy. So I leave this first section of empirical evidence with a couple of thoughts in my mind, and I've mentioned them here. One is that certainly fiscal policy matters, and certainly it's somewhere around 1/3. We can not capture the channel in which this fiscal policy is acting on the economy, or the agents in this case, whether it is working directly on the agents, or is it working from a budget constraint point of view, or is it a constraint, or is it changing incentives, or something which I'm not really sure of. So, and I'm not really sure of, I'm sure of the relative magnitude, but I'm not sure of the size of these magnitudes. So I know government spending is larger than tax multipliers and then excise multipliers, but I don't know why and what's the mechanism here. So the why and the what mechanism is what I'm trying to explore here in this model. Now I go to the model part of the presentation. We look at standard New Keynesian model. If you want, you can take screenshots of the slides, and I might just send the slides later on, but this is a summary of what a standard New Keynesian model looks like. These are RBC models at the core, with consumers who are essentially consuming a variety of domestic and imported goods. I say domestic and imported goods because I'm thinking of an open economy model, but you should think of goods that a consumer in Kerala is consuming from Kerala and Tamil Nadu and other states, right? A consumer who works, supplies labor, saves in government bonds directly or indirectly, and saves in mutual funds, if you think about it like that. That's the consumers doing. The RBC model is adopted to the Indian setting with two changes. There is a currency union, which means the federal RBI and the federal government are common to all states, but these states have independent fiscal policies. I just thought I should mention this, not take it obviously, but yes, these are the two overarching model justifications that I'm doing because I'm adopting these two Indian states. Consumers are your standard, producers are your standard, and New Keynesian producers are the ones which pack a punch. They are monopolistically competitive producers who have a certain degree of market power and can actually fix prices infrequently. How we implement it is something to make fun of, but the empirical reality is fine. Productivity is stochastic and region specific. So while these states have these consumers and producers, they have different productivities. So they have different productivities, and that matters in how they use their resources and how they use the fiscal policy. Now come to the main part of the model, that's government spending. Government spending, unlike bulk of the literature, is adopted to Indian states, obviously. And Indian states largely have 4 instruments, of which I'm capturing 3, because the 4th is a bit of a difficult thing to capture specifically from the modeling perspective. I'm capturing government spending, VAT, and excise duty. These are exogenous, but so these are shocks. They're not modeled. Only producers and consumers are modeled. So producers and consumers interact in an economy where they observe these fiscal policies being acted upon by the government. All right. Consumers. Now, this is again a very simple model. I'm not sure if how much I would want to explain if you all are already familiar with. But this is a representative consumer who consumes, has habit of consumption, which means whatever he consumed last period, he tends to sort of consume some proportion of that. Even now, he has labor supply and he gains utility from government spending. So all your public expenditure and so on, the utility function is separable. I don't want to assign weight to the separability, but there are others who have talked about the inseparability and other issues and so on. The consumer who is in the home region is in the mass 0 to n, and the foreign region is of mass n to 1. So in total in India, there are one unit of mass consumers, of which n proportion are in the home country and 1 minus n are in the foreign country. So that determines the size of the population, which can be an important factor, specifically thinking about the size of demand in these models. The consumer chooses these flow of consumption in labor and the bonds based on this budget constraint. The budget constraint is a nominal budget constraint where this is what I spend on consumption. This is my government spending that I am doing now. This is the state contingent security that I am using, that I'm buying today. These are the right-hand side are my income. First is my income from realization of government bonds, realization of state contingent securities. These are the states. You don't need to really know that to get the essence. This is the labor income. This is my profit income. And these are lump sum taxes. Lump sum taxes are a simplifying assumption, but we can drop them later on. It's not really required. Now, to make this model an open economy model, the aggregate consumption is actually divided into domestic consumption and foreign consumption, right? So this is the part of total consumption which is consumed by, or which from the domestic economy. This is that part of consumption which is consumed from the foreign economy. So if I am a consumer in Kerala, this is my Kerala, this is my consumption from the Kerala production part, and this is my consumption from the rest of the India. So you can think of it as proportion. I consume my local good as 60%, 40% is imported good. That can be for a variety of reasons. Even my own consumption is not just a simple consumption of one good. There is a variety of good in my own economy, and that variety is given by this Dixit-Stiglitz aggregator. So just to recollect, I consume, I choose how much to consume. Then I choose of this total consumption how to divide between domestic consumption, foreign consumption. Once I've chosen how to divide domestic and foreign consumption, I choose within the domestic consumption which firm to give my money to. Because remember, these firms have monopoly power. So that becomes important in this model. Now, producers, how much time has gone by? Just to check.
So you've taken about half an hour, so 15-20 minutes is what is left. Yeah.
All right, fine. So I'll just rush through the model part and then we'll talk about the results, so on. So producers in this economy are, and this is something which, so you see that I've kept the production function very simple. This A is state specific. So state of Kerala, producers in the state of Kerala, all producers have the same productivity. Only difference in firm productivity is from Kerala and Tamil Nadu. All Kerala producers have the same productivity. Now, these firms can supply to the Kerala economy. They can supply to the foreign consumers. So they can supply to the domestic consumers. They can supply to the foreign consumers. For them, it's export outside the state. We assume law of one price holds. It's just a simplifying assumption. You can add a lot of pricing parameters by discriminatory pricing to region and so on. It might change our fiscal policy, but it's not really essential to the story. Right? Okay. Now, fiscal policy is what is important in this part. This is the price after VAT. So I am choosing a price after I know what the government VAT is, right? So my own government's VAT is important for me. Foreign government's VAT is also important for me because I am setting my prices based on the realization of my own VAT and the foreign government's VAT. The other tax which is of importance, and this is how I model excise duty as, is a payroll subsidy. So excise duty can be thought of as a payroll subsidy, which increases production. And that's why I'm modeling excise duty like this, like a payroll subsidy. While VAT is at the consumption side of it, excise duty is at the production side of it. So that's the distinction between VAT and excise duty. Reduction in excise duty stimulates producers. Reduction in VAT stimulates consumers. Obviously, the end effect and the sharing of taxes depends on the market. But that's how the taxes are modeled in this economy. Now, producers are have a monopoly power of their own, but they also have a luck factor which allows them to change their prices with this probability. But if they cannot change their prices, what they do is they observe last year's domestic inflation and they adjust their current prices based on last year's domestic inflation. So if I'm not able to change my prices because of luck, bad luck potentially, you can think of it as contracts binding and so on, then I just use my past prices and adjust my prices accordingly. Right? That's essentially the first order condition in this case is a pricing decision which takes care of two distinct things. I should not have, but that's the standard practice to put these equations there. But the logic of this equation is only twofold. One, my pricing decision is based on the size of the demand of this economy, and the pricing decision is based on some sort of the ratio between marginal cost and marginal revenue. That's essentially what this boils down to. Right? Okay. Fiscal policy in these regions. Now, government spending, like the consumer spending, can also be broken down into domestic consumption and foreign consumption. This is just for convenience. It's also true in reality. Some of the government spending can be imported in the Indian case, especially. I think of this as a balanced budget economy in which government balances its budget just due to federal rules. You can also think of this economy as an imbalanced budget economy, but it complicates the model, and that part is also there in the paper. And federal fiscal policies. Federal policies are monetary policies. I also ignore fiscal transfers from the federal government, though there is an important rule and role for federal transfers. But I assume that they are non-equalizing, which means any federal transfers should not change the relative magnitudes of these relative fiscal policies. Now, calibration. I'm going to skip the calibration part. They're just details of how I get the number. That part can be looked at in the paper, but let's just think of how I'm using this model now, right? The idea of this is, hey, I have states which have their own fiscal policies, and I want to understand how these fiscal policies are generating changes in output in my own state and changes in output in the foreign state. That's essentially what I'm thinking about. Then I also want to compare for one state how these different fiscal policies, that is government spending, VAT and excise duty, how different they are in terms of the transmission. And specifically, I'm looking at two types of transmissions, the domestic transmission to domestic output, and fiscal transmission, which is the spillover part of it. Now, what this does is this uses the exogenous part of the model, which is the fiscal policy. And I am thinking of the shock to fiscal policies. And then I'm saying, hey, if you think of your standard aggregate demand, aggregate supply question, like this is what I draw in my class. This is the aggregate demand and this is the aggregate supply. If I'm thinking of comparative statics, which is the version of the paper which I've sent to Nathaniel, that tells me if I go from this point to this point, how would prices respond and how would output respond? So these are prices and these are output. I still think on these lines. This is the comparative statics exercise, which is there in the paper. But what I'm going to present today is the dynamics. What I'm going to show you are now impulse response functions, which track the movement from this point to this point onwards. Remember, what I'm trying to do here is to shift the aggregate demand curve from A to A prime through increase in government spending, reduction in VAT, and reduction in excise duty. And I want to compare how much this shifts right and what implication does it have on the prices and on the other economy. That's essentially what I'm trying to do here. All right. The shock process, again, I'm not really going into the details of the model, but now let's look at the first impulse response function. So here what I'm doing is I am asking the home government in the state to increase its government expenditure by 1 standard deviation shock. You can think of it as 100 rupees, or to be fair, you should think of it as 1% of government spending, whatever that is, to the respective government. A percent increase in government spending when there is trade between the home and the foreign economy leads to only a 0.5% increase in output of this economy. That's the number that I am selling here, right? To be precise and to be also comparative to a situation where there would not have been a trade, or I would not have used open economy models, I would have said that the number goes up by 0.6%. So the difference between the 0.5 and 0.6 is just trade. So there's that percentage point difference between having trade and not having trade. This channel is known as the aggregate demand channel. It's your standard Y equals C plus I plus G. G increases, Y increases by that much. This channel can also be explained by the fact that an increase in government spending causes firms to sell more. If firms sell more, there is greater employment in this economy. There are higher wages in this economy. Higher wages are required so that consumers work. And if consumers work, they provide spending, and that provides output and so on. If you look at this domestic stimulus on the foreign economy, which is trading with this home economy, there is a small stimulus which occurs in the foreign economy. And why this happens is my question. Like, why is a spending in Kerala economy stimulating Tamil Nadu economy? The model-based answer to this question is a rise in relative prices in the home country. And I will not make you read this. I will show you the figure here. So the left-hand panel is the result of a percent increase in government spending actually causes a 0.6% increase in home prices, inflation in the home country. On the other hand, the foreign country also receives an inflationary stimulus, because you see what I'm doing is, since there's home demand, home prices have gone up, consumers are doing what they're doing best, is substituting between home and foreign. They start demanding more of the foreign products. This demand for foreign products by the home economy drives a part of the inflation in the foreign economy. So you will see a stimulus in the foreign economy, but you'll also see a stimulus in, well, an inflation in the foreign economy. This is not correct. This should be inflation, but they are inflation. Right? Okay. Now, one wonders why a percent increase in government spending leads to only 0.6% increase in output. And the part of the reason is that my consumer part of the model is pretty standard. It's not reflecting the nuances which are there in the Indian economy. For instance, Indian economy is a lot of hand-to-mouth consumers which have high marginal propensity to consume. In the standard setup, consumers reduce their consumption because they think that prices are going up. I might not be able to catch up. I might want to reduce my consumption, postpone it to tomorrow. That's essentially what I'm doing. Government is spending a lot today. Prices of things have gone up. It's best for me to just postpone my consumption from today to tomorrow. That's essentially what's happening to consumption in some sense. This is true because this is happening in the presence of an, yep. This is true because this is happening in the presence of an increase in real wages. You see this blue line is real wage by home consumer. And this blue line here is the reduction in consumer by home consumer. So home consumer is getting more money, but also consuming less. So home consumer, and this is because of the Ricardian nature of the consumer. Consumer sees that what the government is spending today, but they might increase taxes tomorrow. So I might want to save up a lot while I'm making more money. That's essentially the channel that is at play here. These channels are standard in the literature. They are intertemporal substitution and wealth effects. Note that there is no wealth effect in this setting because for wealth effects, real wages have to fall. So real wages are actually increasing here in that sense. There is intertemporal substitution to some extent. If I think of how important the flexible and the sticky price model is to the magnitudes, because we are wondering that, okay, we know these magnitudes, but how reliable can they be? And how much is sticky price, which is intrinsic to a New Keynesian model, affecting these numbers? So that magnitude of difference is so this is the difference. This is the blue and the red line are red line is sticky prices and the blue line is flexible prices. So you see, when prices are flexible, price increases by more and interest rate increases accordingly. This green is the interest rate, which is flexible interest rate. So when prices increase, interest rate increase, everything adjusts and not a lot changes. So output stimulus sort of is dumbed down. On the other hand, when prices are sticky, prices don't rise by as much because not everybody gets the opportunity to change their prices and interest rate reacts. Other questions? Okay. All right. I have 10 more minutes, so I will be able to do that. Sorry. Yes, so that's the sticky price flexible. So this, okay. So I've talked about domestic transmission. I've talked about how government spending affects domestic prices, domestic output, consumption, and real wages. Now I want to talk about the main thing that is there in the paper, that's trade transmission. There are a lot of calibration details which are important, but this is the essence. Trade transmission is the idea that if my commodity prices are going up because of a domestic stimulus, I might substitute between domestic and foreign economy, which means Kerala consumers located in Kerala, when the Kerala government is spending, might choose to import Tamil Nadu rice rather than consume domestic Kerala rice, because of this whole effect on prices by the domestic economy. And that is shown by the movement in trade balance here. The red line is the trade balance. The black line is exports and the blue line is imports. Trade balance is the net of exports and imports. Now you should see that at impact, trade balance worsens because I am importing, I'm exporting not as much, and I keep importing. And it worsens further because there is lag effect on my import on the substitution. The substitution is essentially lagged, and that lag in substitution is partly explained by this green line, which is the terms of trade. The terms of trade here is how relative prices in both economies, which are sticky, move. And that is why prices act with a lag in terms of trade acts with a lag. So anything big changes in this, when a policy is introduced, the change in this economy is felt only after a quarter or 2 quarters in this economy. So that's essentially the takeaway. And the idea that, hey, trade does drive a lot of this transmission between economies and fiscal policy, and the commodity substitution channel becomes important. VAT and excise cuts. Now here what I'm doing is I'm saying that, okay, we have understood spending, but let's understand VAT and excise cuts as a significant mechanism of stimulus. the spending in this spending stimulus is high, is as is before. The VAT and excise stimulus are the red line and the black line. The black line is this one, if you can see, and the red line is this one, if you can see. So two things to note. VAT stimulus is bigger than excise stimulus because VAT is on a larger commodity base, and excise stimulus is smaller, but they are all positive. Unlike the spending, which is just a monotonic reduction, the excise and the VAT also have this delayed effect because excise and VAT play along with prices. So they are a part of the prices which adjust slowly. So if you change excise rates, firm will take time to adopt those excise rates and change their prices. That's essentially why this hump in excise and VAT is coming up. But for me, the main takeaway is that spending is still a better instrument for states in comparison to VAT and excise rates. VAT and excise rates are important, but their magnitudes are always smaller in any case than spending. The other thing is the delay. I think that's pretty much all that I wanted to say here. Yes. Now, in terms of their effects on prices and their effects on consumption, private consumption. Remember the idea behind, or the idea behind looking at the difference between government spending and tax is, while government spending is a direct stimulus which shifts aggregate demand to the right, taxes rely on consumers to respond to these stimulus, right? So we need consumption to go up as a response to tax. And this is how consumption goes up. VAT, this is the consumption stimulus of VAT. So largely all the stimulus which is coming to output is actually there in consumption. In fact, consumption is more, so there is some countervailing factor on other factors. And excise is this. Sorry, excise is the later term. Prices, I think, are nothing to talk about. The final thing to talk about is our real wages. Now, this is another important channel of transmission, which is different between excise and VAT. Excise duty does a lot to real wages as opposed to VAT. That's what's coming out from this figure. You see, while excise and VAT have different output transmissions, but their effect on real wages are pretty similar. So excise duty also increases real wages as much as VAT duty does. That is because excise duty is playing from the labor market angle, whereas VAT is playing from a commodity angle. So VAT percolates down from goods market to labor market, whereas excise duty is a direct labor market mechanism for transmission. I wanted to present one more figure, but I think there's too much which I've already presented on in terms of trade distinctions between excise and VAT, but I think maybe next time. I hope there was some insight to what I've been talking about, but I still have a lot of questions which I'm working on, and those are the unresolved questions which are shameless promotion for my other projects that I'm working on. In fact, in the literature, I don't know if you saw that there was a slide which says there is less evidence on frequency of price changes in India. And I know Nathaniel's paper is on frequency of price changes in agriculture market. So that citation has to be drawn, and that is the kind of work that sort of keeps these things up. But yeah, the unanswered questions from a framework perspective, a theory framework perspective, is the optimal taxation issue. That is something which maybe if I had presented this a month from now, I would have done the optimal taxation rather than the impulse response functions. The other idea, and there's a theory-based paper of mine which talks about this impossible convergence because of the way these optimal taxations are transferred. And the other very big part of the fiscal policy of states is the debt dynamics, which I have not touched at all. In fact, RBI had a very beautiful paper on the yield spreads in government bonds across states recently, which says that, hey, debt dynamics is a big channel for fiscal policy transmission, which is a main project that I'm working on. But to sum up, I think endowment for a state matters as much as fiscal policy, if I should say so, because their choice of fiscal policy is intertwined with how they were to begin with and how they are using different instruments of fiscal policy to make use of different transmission channels, which are there in the Indian economy. So I'm going to stop here, and I should say a word before I close. I had sent Nathaniel a version of the paper, which does a lot less, but that's the last closing part of the argument that I did. Now you can see that there is some progression in the arguments that I've built up from that version. And if you look at the paper, if we get a chance to look at the paper, there'll be a comparative statics, dynamics, and optimal taxation exercise together. So that's all that I am here to talk about. I hope there were some questions which you find interesting, and I'll let Nathaniel take over the discussion and guide me towards what can be improved in the presentation and generally the issue.
Okay, thank you, Nikhil, for that illuminating presentation, and we all benefited from your insights, and especially putting things together in a structured manner so that you can think through these issues, and that's the benefit of putting a framework together. So I also have the duty of being the discussant, so I would not take that much time, but as Nikhil said, that the version of the paper that I read was slightly different in the sense that the focus was more on the identification at the reduced form and all that. So some part of my comments that I had prepared for that, I would leave it. Maybe we'll discuss bilaterally. Based on the presentation, I would just try to highlight a few points, and then we would open up for questions, if any. So this is a very interesting paper. It looks at this whole issue about, when different states take policies independently, that each state has its own dynamics in terms of policy. How do you think about the transmission? That suppose if Kerala changes something, how does Tamil Nadu affect vis-a-vis what is the effect on Kerala? And this is important for a country, because if everybody takes their independent policies, they add up to a problem, then it has to be solved at a national level. So from the larger policy-making perspective, is there a coordinated way of doing things? Or if everybody does it on their own, Kerala does its own fiscal policy, Karnataka does its own, does it have the optimal outcome or not? That's the kind of broad. And then the transmission channels are different in some states. Some, say, for example, what he was saying is that spending works well in some states. In production states, it might be excise duty that works. So it depends on, the optimal policy for that state may not be the same as another state. So in that context, he looks at the transmission channels. Suppose if a state changes one of its policy, he looks at three. One is the VAT, other one is the excise, and then the government spending. How does these transmission work across? So these are the basic things that has been done. And how does he do it? He's presented a set of stylized facts saying that there's no absolute convergence. Fiscal policy factors do explain a lot of divergence. So that means that fiscal policy is an important cogwheel in terms of the national convergence. And then getting into this whole thing about structurally thinking about using a new Keynesian model. The model kind of is adapted to Indian case, puts three: government expenditure, VAT, and excise duty. You have the standard properties, and the main results are like government spending expenditure is 0.5. It could have been 0.6 if the trade channel is switched off. Terms of trade channel is very important. Consumption shocks have, are being transmitted through the terms of trade channel. And then finally, he said that excise duty has more real wage effects as compared to VAT, because it actually works as a subsidy on the wage bill. So that's basically the whole kind of, I would kind of summarize what we heard so far in 3 minutes of, just to keep it. Now, the whole thing about a few issues that I'm not getting into specific model details, some of which I might even cursorily mention, but the first thing is that why do we kind of think about all this in terms of a model? We know that if you're more toward trade openness, you are more likely to do a larger spillovers, and the degree of trade openness, something on that, like in terms of the different states trade openness or trade data, some statistics about, in your paper you say that 54% of GDP, Indian GDP is across trade. So something like that in the presentation would have kind of put the audience in perspective, saying that, hey, half of the GDP you consume from other states at the all India level, but that divergence is there. And in your calibration, as of now, you have only 2 home and away. And I think the share is 0.5 in the version of the paper that I got. Like 50% of India is considered as producing states, as home states, so that's the way it's been done. But the whole point is that, say, take states like Kerala, which has a much larger consumption from outside, as compared to, say, like Maharashtra, which is a major producer. So how do you think about that in, what kind of modeling strategy would help you kind of pin down that dynamics is something which you need to think about, as what I would like, say that. But the whole thing about the Ricardian equivalence, I didn't really understand how can real consumption fall. I can understand if real consumption remains constant with wages going up, because Ricardian equivalence means that your current consumption is a function of lifetime income, so that you won't change real consumption at all. Maybe it's because price levels are rising, but then our national prices are rising or relative prices are rising. What are the why would relative prices rise when you have free trade? So that's something which was a little confusing, because for real wages, real consumption to fall, your inflation has to go up, because nominal consumption will still remain the same. But then a Ricardian equivalent consumer will not cut his current consumption to a shock to his nominal wage, because that's what your impulse responses were showing. Maybe I might have missed out something, but that's something which wasn't kind of adding up according to, whatever I could see. This is something which I saw right now, so just maybe I haven't yet followed it completely. So that's something which kind of came, towards the larger questions. One is that when we think about this whole transmission mechanisms, the channel that would be more important would be the whole thing about how does the state fiscal constraint gets affected by its own spending. And then, so the whole idea about the central transfers, which has become even more important post GST. Say, for example, you change your fiscal policy, add more aggregate demand, then some part of the GST gets collected by the center, it gets distributed to all other states. So then the other states gets and that channel has become even more important in post GST. So that would be something, if you're thinking about Indianizing the model, that would be like, your state fiscal constraint should have another variable, which is the central transfer. And the central transfer can be easily modeled as a sum of all the expenditures at the fiscal, subnational level. So therefore, the transmission channel could be explained much better. And I think the current budget constraint that you have in the model completely lacks that, and that has become increasingly the dominant channel of resource transfer across states, and states, ultimately the state's economic outcomes would be dependent on what happens through that channel. And the whole thing about the terms of trade channel, if we think about the terms of trade channel at a longer period of time, with the common currency union and the law of one price holds, empirical estimates show that at least weekly it holds, inflation rates kind of converge across over time. So terms of trade may not have a trend, or terms of trade would be in the long run stability of the equation. You would expect terms of trade to come back to its stationary level. So in that sense, a state in itself doing an expansionary policy might work only in the short term, because terms of trade will, in the end, either through increasing foreign prices or through the fall in domestic prices, your terms of trade are going to come back to ground zero. You're not going to have the terms of trade channel explaining the expansionary effects over the long term. So in the short term, you might be able to do it in the absence of others doing it. And if you expect a rational government, if you think about a set of state governments. If one state does increase and the other state know that their welfare is going to be, lower at the end of the day, because it's going to be a zero-sum game. So you might not have long-term effects from, because you said that, a government spending could be a more desirable way, but that's conditional on the fact that it is short-term, and also that other states don't follow it. Because if every state raises expenditure by the same amount, all of these effects cancel out, right? I think that's the way it works. And so that's something which I was thinking about. And the larger policy questions would be, say, I was going to talk about the SDL paper, because that's another channel, that if you keep raising your expenditure without domestic resources, you're going to be priced higher on the debt market, and there is already empirical evidence, and which you have rightly highlighted. So from that channel also, so the way I would say is that opportunistic shocks might work, but it cannot be like a long-term solution, given that you are under a common fiscal or common monetary union with significant fiscal transfers coming in. So these are some of the issues I think to think through, and to put things in perspective, and maybe in terms of some smaller things, like have a look at the Taylor rule coefficient, because I think there is something 0.05 for output gap. That shouldn't be that. I don't know, because we don't discount output that much, and I have to say that. And then there's this issue about 91-day T-bill being taken as the interest rate. That's 5, whereas it's 5.8. If you take the 91-day, you could have very well taken the SDL rates. So I'm just saying that the referees shouldn't come back to you saying that you're off the mark on things. So just some of the things that I've seen, and also like this whole thing about your consumers have been aggregated using and producer both are aggregated using the same share, whereas ideally I would see that the home and so you're assuming production and consumption is the same in both the states, but I would ideally see that the production sector should be used, the production weights, and expenditure weights should be used for aggregating the consumption. So that those things can be done, which would reduce the number of revisions that you would get. So I thought I'll just tell you upfront. And overall, it's a nice paper, an issue which receives less attention. So we are happy that you've taken it up, and I would open it up for the floor.
Thank you so much. I have actually just a list of suggestions which.
Would you like to respond to Nathaniel so that the rest can be wrapped up? Nikhil?
Yeah, so I've just recorded the list.
Or take further questions from the floor.
Well, further questions.
You like to have questions, okay? Yeah.
Yes.
I thought it was, see, very often than not, I personally believe that the reward should be given for raising questions. I think the issue that you raised is $1 million question of much relevance for a contemporary India. And for that, you deserve enormous amount of appreciation. In fact, this is something which I think I think in social science, the basic is raising the right question. You raise right question. I think that we appreciate that. I also of the view that this seminar should have been presented in gift for a day, not in 40 minutes. Because the whole gamut of issues that you have brought in hardly 45 minutes could not be grasped. And of course, I know that since an RBI man can grasp, for others, it's not very easy. I think I don't think that we have fully grasped the importance of the way in which you have articulated. But then having said this, when you talk about fiscal policy, for someone who is living on the ground, not in theory, we in GIFT, we live with the minister, for example, minister, we have to meet the people who burn their head on a day-to-day basis with the ACS, Chief Secretary of Finance. No, we get very hard questions. So that is what actually drives us. And when for us, fiscal policy quintessentially means expenditure, you rightly said, revenue, debt, and deficit. These are the four key things which we are concerned about. When you talk about expenditure, it's a catch-all term. It's a catch-all term because you have got revenue expenditure over there, revenue capital expenditure over there, salary expenditure over there, pension there, you know, that in Kerala, the kind of thing going on. And when you are capturing the whole thing for theory, it looks beautiful, in fact. And can we, you know, the question is, we have to start somewhere. You have started it. This is more to kind of, you know, if what is the meaning of now this each of the element, you can be kind of do it in a little bit more in a kind of disaggregated manner. And secondly, equally important is that when we are talking about regional economies, we are talking at different levels. In fact, Dr. Isaac would have been thrilled to be here. T.M. Thomas Isaac, our former finance minister and our former chairman, could have been thrilled to be here. He wanted us to do a lot of work on this because GST data is coming in. And you have not said anything about data, in fact. You know, you didn't. I don't think that anything was said about data. And how these numbers were arrived at, we didn't know, in fact. And that is precisely where a question comes like, say, for example, when you're talking about the inter-regional spillovers, the extent of integration between them, and particularly the characterization of the economy that we are talking about, which you already said, in fact, endowments, you essentially mean that captures that. You are aware of that. That is something which is equally could have been, and the point which I would like to say is, it is because the lack of time that you could not perhaps explain. And secondly, some of the findings, like, say, for example, government expenditure, indeed leading to inflation, then you find that your real wages is increasing. That is something which is a very difficult thing to understand unless you have a very peculiar labor market wherein you are able to raise your money wage enormously high. You know, despite that kind of a situation, how one could kind of understand that. But I have a lot of small questions like that, which I'm not going to go in, but and also, I mean, okay, I'm not going to go into that. But the point which I want to say that we appreciate you a lot in terms of raising wonderful question and particularly also putting it in a highly theoretically analytical way. And now, of course, we will be thinking in terms of from bottom, in terms of how much is the data can do. And also when you are talking about the tax changes and exchange changes are in fact not very much of relevance because we are living in a one country, one tax. Because, you know, whether it is of any relevance today, when you're, this is something which, and also even excise also, of course, I mean, particularly with the during the GST regime, this question is how does it get translated? That's something which perhaps we may have to, but your data perhaps I think is pertaining to 80s and 90s. It might have been really working, in fact, could be. Thank you very much. It is really good. And I'm sure others will have a lot of questions to ask. At the end, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Let me first of all congratulate you, Nikhil, for two things. One, presenting a highly structured paper. And it would be a great learning experience for our students. I think we need to learn a lot from that. You know, the way he has structured the papers, highly structured. That's one. Second, combines theory and empirics very meaningfully. I think this is again something that we can all learn from that. So let me congratulate you on these two grounds. Of course, there are many other things that. But then, as Professor Joseph just mentioned, I would say this would apply much more to a pre-GST sort of a regime. Because now where is the tax flexibility for the states? There is hardly any tax flexibility left for the states. We often talk about lack of autonomy and all that. So your paper applies more to a pre-GST sort of a regime. But there too, I have some difficulty in the way you combine, value-added tax and excise. My understanding is that excise is basically levied by the central government, and the way the states really do not have any flexibility. And even, yeah, that's actually largely it is the central government. Exactly, that's outside anyway the scope. So these you are combining this, VAT and excise. I have some difficulty in that because excise, you cannot call it a fiscal policy of the state government. It's much more the central government. So that's out. And again, even value added tax, there was not much flexibility because one of the conditions when, the states went on from the sales tax to the value added tax regime was you only had very few slabs. So there again, the flexibility was much less. So I think this is something which you need to really bring into your sort of a modeling, because otherwise people like me keep on asking these questions. Then of course, I think I'll stop with this. I had a few other sort of a things, but maybe for a later.
Nikhil, Kiran here.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, yes. Hi.
I have a couple of clarificatory questions.
Yes.
One is, see, in the model that you built, you saw state spending or revenue is completely its own discretionary power, right? Which is not so. And Nathaniel has also rightly pointed out, see how much state spends on some of these items is also, for some states at least, is conditional upon how much it receives from the government, union government. Right. So, but I don't know if you have the flexibility to add that component to model and then work out the results. That is one. And the other part is about, see, when you're talking about trade transmission, see, I think you're assuming trade in final goods, right? Or you're also considering trade in intermediate goods? Because, see, that will actually change the way it is going to operate, if I'm right? So
Yes.
is there any, I mean, I know at least theoretically there are models that Jones started at trade in intermediate goods. I don't know if those models can be extended within the framework that you have set up. And look at the differential. Say, why I brought this up is, say, for instance, Kerala and Maharashtra, or maybe Tamil Nadu. So Kerala might be having a lot of trade in terms of final goods, right? But you take, for instance, Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu, they will have a lot of trade in intermediate goods as well, right? So how will these transmissions operate when we disaggregate states into these components? Okay, that is another part. And when you're talking about price spillovers, say for instance, let's hypothetically talk about price spillovers of say Tamil Nadu and Kerala. What you said in terms of how would affect consumption in Kerala would be true if there are no active state interventions in terms of offering subsidy or a very effective PDS. Right. Say, for instance, we have a very strong government support. This transmission may not happen in the same way we expected in the theory model, right? Right. So, how do you control that in the model? Okay, and yeah, just adding to Nathaniel's comment, wherein you talked about when you were calibrating the model, you have taken 0.5, right? Interstate trade. So there is a recent paper using the GST in network trade. So they kind of estimated the interstate trade. Okay, I'll try and share the paper with you. That paper perhaps will give you, these coefficients to calibrate your model better. Okay, but that said, it's a very, very interesting paper, and I want to just reiterate what Professor Narayana said. At least for students, it will be a great learning experience in terms of how to organize your thought process and build it into a model and then test it. that way it's a very, very learning experience for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Nikhil, could you please kind of quickly
Yes.
go through? I'm not asking you to go by comment, but generally.
So I have about
Nikhil, just we have one more intervention here. After that, sorry.
Yeah.
Hello, I am Anita Kumari. Nikhil, it's a very nice presentation. I have 2-3 doubts. The first one is regarding, you mentioned that the state having independent fiscal policy. That initial remark itself is, I have doubt, because generally states don't have an independent fiscal policy, because especially in India, the constitutional driven powers the states have for taxing, even for expenditure and for debt creation, everything. So that proposition is, I am having a little bit doubt. That's the first question. And the second one is regarding, you mentioned that the higher the government spending, higher the growth. But actually, in the government spending, borrowing is also a part. So you avoided borrowing in your debt dynamics fully outside your model. So how do you, explain that thing? That's the second question. And also you avoided fiscal deficit also, because fiscal deficit has a major role in deciding our revenue deficit or revenue expenditure, and also capital expenditure. So that aspect also has to be considered. That's a thing. And you said that 1/3 of the growth decides fiscal policy. So 2/3, what is your explanation for the 2/3 growth? That's another thing. Another important thing is, you mentioned that majority of the states having balanced budgets, but generally it is not like that. Many states having revenue deficit and all. And another thing you mentioned about the excise duty, and I think our Narayana sir already mentioned that excise duty and VAT, you have it's having different stimulus effect. But in the case for consumers, you said that no excise duty for producers and VAT for consumers. Actually, both are indirect taxes, and the final tax is given by the consumers. So both having an effect. That's why now you have to consider that in that way, that the final price is excess duty merging price is what, so that has to be considered. And another thing is that regarding this central transfers, actually states like Bihar, they are getting more than 50% of their revenue from central government. So how how will you avoid this central transfers from your model? Then you don't get that correct I think results. I think mainly these are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So if I can respond, well, these are a lot to work with. I think the comments would be in sort of 2 channels from an academic perspective. The model-based comments, which Nathaniel and Joseph sir explained in terms of the consumption, the real consumption directions. Then there were issues of calibration, which he pointed out, but actually I'm not aware of, which would be helpful because of my lack of ignorance in terms of how the Indian data is. So those things, I think, especially the Ricardian equivalence thought, I am still thinking about it, about how exactly the channel is working. Maybe part of the way the consumption is responding is a model idiosyncrasy and might not be appropriate for our setting. So I'm still thinking about whether there's something in the model which is peculiar here. And I have a lot of peculiarities in the model, the way that I'm modeling. So I will keep the model comments in writing, and I'll maybe respond in written, maybe because it'll be helpful for me to share your thoughts on particular aspects of the model and how the data and the model sort of match. Now, in terms of the real questions, especially pertaining to VAT and excise duty, the tricky thing, and I've done this for some time now, and the reason is like it's very hard to capture the VAT regime because a lot of states have different productions, which is why I say endowment matters. Because some states, so for instance, I have one product in one state and the other product for the other state, and they fall into different categories of VAT. That implies that their VAT rates would be different. So there is an implied production structure which would imply a different taxation both across states. So so there's an endogenous production structure difference which creeps into these revenues which are shown in the budgets. So, and I know that is important. Excise, I thought that states have control over setting excise on, say, alcohol and petrol and so on. So I was just thinking in terms of control of revenue, but I am aware of the budgetary issues. Now, as far as the fiscal deficit, central state transfers, they're all very pertinent questions. But from a modeling perspective, I think there is merit, but it deserves another paper. Like the whole thing deserves another paper. The credit channel and the fiscal deficit channel are very important channels of their own. I think this is just a paper to establish those channels. The other sort of category of comment was trade. So yes, in fact, I am searching for anyone who has data which can help me calibrate the trade parameters between states. And the model is general enough so that questions which Nathaniel raised about Maharashtra, Gujarat being different, they can actually be incorporated into the model. I can set up the model to represent Kerala, vary the trade share and calibrate the model based on Kerala's economy, particularly, and shares and so on, and with respect to others. So, but the thing is, for me, there is not enough gain in doing that exercise without actually looking at the data. And I don't have data. There isn't publicly available data, which I have. The only data which I could proxy it with are two: DGIC data and IGST data. IGST is levied on goods which are produced in one state but sold in another state. There's data problem there. DGIC data has unstructured data of product trade, which is not usable. So the next step in looking at and establishing this model in terms of its trade transmission would be to have the GST data, use the GST data to hook up the trade transmission between these states and talk about these numbers a bit more concretely, I think. But these are altogether, I think, 10, 20, 36, 38 questions of all. I think they're all very amazing. And I think this would take me a lot of discussion to go through, but at the same time, also excited to present and to talk about the issue of optimal taxations and optimal policies per se. But I don't know, again, whether optimal policy will be a relevant discussion in the post-GST era or not. But yes, theoretically, the academic in me talks about optimal policy, but in reality, I think the way the budget constraint for different states varies across the states and credit transmissions is something which I'm working on in the side. So I think that's all that I can grasp from the rich comments and digest at this time. But I will keep your comments and I will reach out to you for sure with specific directions on where I am not really clear. And I would really be happy if you have a sense or direction from your experience of these things. And I'm sure all of you would have more experience with the fiscal policy day to day. I would want that experience to sort of mediate through the model and give us results which are in some sense usable as well as theoretically sound. So that's sort of my endeavor in some sense. Thank you so much for inviting me here. Yeah.
Thank you, Nikhil, for the wonderful presentation and summing up all the comments. So this has been a great presentation, made us think through a lot of things. Perhaps in a post GST world, you would see there are two things that I would kind of summarize from the comments. One is that in a post GST world, it would be the role of central transfers. I remember the Chicago Rage paper that you have cited in your paper. They look at the central transfers as a shock to state budgets constraint, and therefore how that percolates. So that would be an interesting channel that you can think of, given that now state level tax policies are not that important, whereas transfers are becoming even more important in terms of how it is affecting the budgets of the states. So you could look at exogenous variations in such transfers like disaster funds and all that. That could give you a good identification. I would kind of encourage you to look at that. And the other thing would overall be that, rather than thinking about this paper as the variations with, expenditure versus VAT versus excise, it could simply be a paper where you look at, does discretionary expenditure change by one state, lead to an optimal outcome over a long period of time, or within the short period of time, what are the trade-offs? Because that's where the more important thing comes. As Joseph sir was saying, that each state has its own constraints. So what does those translate into constraints? Are they going to be priced in the debt market? Are they going to be, long-term sustainability issues, levels of debt? All of that will come in. I think those two are the kind of focal points that you could be thinking about. Like, this is kind of my final concluding remark. And thank you all for all the great questions. All of them were very relevant and really enriched the paper, and it contributed to everybody's knowledge, and I'm so happy. And one word of final is that whatever I have said is not the Reserve Bank's view. It is my personal view, which I forgot to start with. So I'm saying at this point of time, this is kind of a administrative disclaimer that I have to say. Thank you, sir, and over to Joseph, sir.
Thank you very much. I think after the formal thanking, I'll also come back for one. Over to the coordinator for the formal thank you.
Okay. On behalf of GIFT community, I would like to thank Nikhil Damodaran for accepting our invitation and sharing your thoughts on fiscal policy transmission. As I earlier remarked, it is a very, very interesting work and very relevant for GIFT. As you started initially, it is very much part of our mandate. So to that extent, a lot of us have learned a lot in terms of how it, the transmission channels work. And also, especially for the PhD students, I hope they all understood, if not the model, at least, how and where the cutting edge research in fiscal policy or broadly in the area of fiscal policy is moving. And thank you for taking your time and presenting your paper here. And I would like to thank Dr. Nathaniel. I know you are a very, very busy person, but even then you considered our request and you spared your time to be with us, and also chaired the session so well, and also for your excellent remarks for Nikhil's paper. I am sure he understands. I mean, he has already acknowledged the valuable insights you provided, and I'm sure it will help him revise the paper and submit it to a journal. Thank you for your time. And I would like to thank all the faculty members who are present here and also for their excellent remarks. And I would like to thank the participants both offline and online. And last but not the least, I would like to thank our director who has constantly been pushing us to conduct more such seminars. And I hope we keep up to his expectations. And one last word of thanks to the IT team, who have always been doing excellent job in conducting these online webinars, seamlessly. Thank you, everyone. Now over to the director.
Yeah, I think it was a wonderful afternoon. And I meant that it is a presentation not for 45 minutes, it's for a day. So there is a standing invitation to both of you. to visit gift. Okay, tell me when you want to come. You are invited at that.
Thank you so much.
To both of you.
Thank you.
And tell me
Thank
how many days you can spare with us, and you will be our esteemed guest. And you are invited. This is an invitation.
Just a point. I know Nathaniel has been visiting Trivandrum, but not us.
When he was always
Like-
busy. He was always busy. He was always busy. I know. Whenever he comes, he calls, but he comes with 30 days program and go and goes in 2 days. But next time, okay, both of you. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Also, you must be getting late, of course. When are you getting back to India?
Well,
Nikhil?
right now it's unknown. Right now it's unknown. So, but maybe next semester.
Right. When you are in India, please let us know.
Yes, yes, sure.
Nathani, I mean what I said. Okay.
So the problem is that most of the time that I'm in Trivandrum is actually like not working days for gift, because I would be coming on a Friday evening and Monday morning I would be back at office. So when I'm there during working time,
Being
definitely.
recorded. People think that we don't work. It's being recorded, Nathaniel.
No, I said I only travel during holidays.
Okay.
So definitely next time, like, I'll definitely
No,
come
Nathaniel,
over. Yes,
holidays,
sir.
holidays can be converted into working days here. Because if,
The students, the students would blame me. Just kidding.
you
You
can-
are-
No, sir. Definitely next time when I'm coming. So I'm actually traveling to Canada next month. So post that I would be coming back. So just,
Okay.
all right. Thank you so much, sir.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Nikhil. Good night.
You can
Bye-bye,
close the
Nathaniel.
close the. Yeah. Thanks for. Yeah.